The, uh, this is actually a talk that I had come up with as a potential paper at the end of my pregnancy last year, and then ended up giving birth early, and so I didn't write it. And it's been kind of sitting there, and I thought, well, this would be really, Liverpool reached out, this might be kind of like a fun excuse to dig this back up and rethink through some of these things, look at some of the changes in the literature that have happened since. Um, so I've never given this talk before, so hopefully I can maintain the thesis since I did just test positive for COVID yesterday, um, and have been feeling rather ill. But I really wanted to make sure I gave this talk. I was really excited about it. So uh, we'll make it through this together. So yes, who am I? Hi, I'm Dr. Sarah Lacy. I'm a biological anthropologist, paleoanthropologist, bio bioarchaeologist at the University of Delaware. However, I've actually had appointments at other institutions, Cal State Dominguez Hills, University of Missouri St. Louis, before this, and have done field work in um, Germany, Kenya, Macedonia, and a lot of different places, um, which has been really fun. And of course, that's not usually what we get known for, though. And I feel like the reason why I've been asked to be doing talks a lot lately is more because of this kind of stuff. Um, I had the cover article with a colleague, Kara Achenbach of Scientific American, the year before, very end of 2023, that I guess upset a lot of men on the internet. Because how dare we say that women in the Paleolithic were hunting along with everyone else? Um, and also, having been in an institution in Los Angeles, you're the nearest archaeologist, so ended up on a lot of wild television programs like The Unexplained with William Shatner. But now I'm on the East Coast. I'm no longer the de facto archaeologist to get tapped in Los Angeles, so we'll see if that continues. Though I did film a show recently called Big Feminine Energy that's coming out in Canada later this month. So I'm excited to see that one. But really, what this talk is about is, we think about these kind of foundational questions in our disciplines. When we're writing grants, for instance, we always try to kind of like pivot and orient the work that we're doing to these big questions, right? And certainly in paleoanthropology, one of them is how did early modern humans outcompete Neanderthals? It's like basically everything in the field, if you study anything in the late Pleistocene in Western Eurasia, gets oriented towards this question. Um, and even like right in this comic that's a number of years old at this point, a reference to that, right? This idea that modern humans and Neanderthals came into contact, and modern humans were um, better adapted, had better hunting techniques, had better anatomy, all sorts of things that let them outcompete Neanderthals. Now, any of you that work on Neanderthals know that that story of, you know, outcompeting or better anatomy, better hunting skills, etc. Every time we kind of challenge one of those questions, it's failed to be supported. But we still keep setting everything up against this straw man of early modern humans were better than Neanderthals, which is why they're here, and how can we find evidence of it? So, who are Neanderthals, right? And I say here many flavors of humanity over the last 2 million years. But generally, right, these what you often think of are these large-brained, really robust humans living across Europe and into Central Asia. If we compare them to other hominins alive at the exact same time, their culture is very sophisticated, right? It's maybe an unfair comparison when you compare Neanderthals to late Upper Paleolithic modern humans and all the cave art and things like that, because those are not the people they were competing with, right? But that morphological package, right? These suite of anatomical traits that we associate with Neanderthals, right? The separated brow ridge, the occipital bun, etc., largely disappears by 40,000 years ago as a suite together. Those individual traits do not disappear, but the suite of them as like a package in one person disappears. And so if we think about the word Neanderthal, right? I always joke with my students that like every time the New York Times describes like a certain red-haired politician as a Neanderthal, like I'm in the comment section, like that's unfair. Uh, But if we look at Merriam-Webster, right, the second definition there for Neanderthal is a person who suggests a caveman in appearance, mentality, and behavior. And when we look at the synonyms or sentence examples, right, some Neanderthals continue to resist education reforms. Synonyms are things like idiot, lump, stupid. So we're thinking about how we communicate our work, especially like a larger population outside of academia. Like this is what people think of when they think of Neanderthals. But I would also argue that like it doesn't completely go away within academia as well, right? This idea that Neanderthals are some sort of like 90% human, they're like not quite there, right? Is pretty pervasive. Um, so the Middle Paleolithic to Upper Paleolithic is that cultural transition that we see in the archaeological record that we generally associate with the shift from Neanderthals to early modern humans. And so I want to give like a quick little kind of lesson of like how we've talked about that shift over time. Um, Certainly how we view Neanderthals has changed from like right this idea of they were dead ends to cousins to ancestors. But even at the end, we'll look at some papers in the last 5 years and how they've talked about them. There's quite a bit of diversity still in how people are framing who Neanderthals are, right? This is my I got Sir Arthur Keith here, so going way back, right, describing what's happening in Southwest Asia at School Tabun as a population in the throes of evolution, trying to describe why you have these Neanderthals and early modern humans ostensibly at the same time making the same material culture. However, obviously, he didn't have access to the kinds of dating techniques we have now. But it is funny now if you think of what the paper that just came out a month ago about the individual at school, which we will talk about, the child at school who appears to be a modern human Neanderthal hybrid. So looks like Arthur Keith gets to come back. Um, so if we think about how this is constantly portrayed in like a textbook, right? This idea that, most of the discipline had this debate of the replacement model versus the multi-regional model. And I think that's like clearly an oversimplification of what was happening. But right, for most of the 20th century, there was kind of just like a de facto assumption that fossil people in a part of the world had some continuity with people who live in that region today. But in the 80s and 90s, that starts to shift, right? Especially when we start having I mean, of course, we see that just in the archaeological records, interpretations of it, right? Even like Chris Stringer's work. But in the 80s, we have the first mitochondrial global surveys, which suggests that everyone is closely related to each other, less than 200,000 years, and with a root in Africa. Though I do always think it's funny that that big paper if you look in the supplemental materials, shows a tree that's almost equally as likely with a root in Asia. But generally, right, all the other evidence kind of supports this idea that there's a root in Africa. Everyone left Africa relatively recently, less than 200,000, and therefore humans are much more closely related than some of these fossils would suggest, suggesting then that those fossils are not our ancestors, right? This certainly got a lot of media attention at the time as well. So we enter the 2000s, which is like when I think about myself in undergrad, starting college in like 2004. My very first Neanderthal class was 2006, and this paper had just come out, again from the Max Planck group, but attempting to do well, they wanted all sorts of DNA, but what they were able to get was mitochondrial DNA from a sample from the Neanderthal, the original Neanderthal, and they had to take a very large section of the humerus, as you can see from this picture, which when I was in Bonn and saw it, it's like heartbreaking to think of having to take such a massive piece of such an important fossil to get mitochondrial DNA. But comparing against a relatively small sample of modern people, it appeared that the Neanderthal lineage was a complete outgroup and that the Neanderthal mitochondrial lineage was not present in living humans and therefore kind of was viewed as this kind of nail in the coffin for solidifying out of Africa that Neanderthals did not interbreed with modern humans and they were not our ancestors and no one was carrying at least their mitochondrial lineage. So other sorts of descriptions at the time of things that looked intermediate, like La Gravelio, became kind of taboo. I was in Germany in 2009, as an early graduate student excavating, and I was Eric Trinkus's student who have published quite a bit on La Gravelio, and I got some very I got aggressive comments from people about like, why does he think that this kid is a hybrid? There's no hybridization going on, and I'm like, I'm a grad student. I, don't make me defend my advisor. But I definitely, was frustrated with how people were mischaracterizing what he had said because he was arguing that potentially this individual came from a population that had experienced hybridization in the past, not that he was a first generation hybrid. I even had to correct that on the Wikipedia more than once, actually. So if we look kind of across the literature, we're seeing a lot of descriptions of Neanderthals as a different species than modern humans. We're even seeing people describing it as like, well, even if they tried to interbreed, their offspring would be sterile like donkeys, which like donkeys are sterile because Neanderthals, I mean, horses and mules have a different number of chromosomes. So it's like, are you suggesting that Neanderthals have a different number of chromosomes? Like, but this was definitely happening quite a bit. Even though if we look at just recent, like contemporary modern human genetic DNA, like genetic material, we're seeing um, potential evidence of a little bit of assimilation, right? And Alan Templeton, who is not an anthropologist, who's firmly over as a geneticist, published a number of papers in the mid 2000s just looking at modern human genetic variation and arguing that, okay, yes, we see mostly out of Africa, but there is still gene flow from archaic humans. We're still seeing largely an isolation by distance model. There's even some evidence of some backflow of material, genetic material back into Africa. But these papers are largely ignored by paleoanthropologists. I might be a bit biased because Alan Templeton taught me population genetics, um, but I was always kind of surprised that these papers weren't being more centered in anthropology. But they get their comeuppance when in 2010 when the Max Planck group in Leipzig publishes the Neanderthal genome and says, "Oh, never mind what we said about mitochondrial DNA. Neanderthals are definitely many people's ancestors," right? And obviously this was a huge deal for the field, as a huge deal for science, right? Since Svati Pabo got the Nobel Prize in 2022. But they also frame this as, okay, we did interbreed with Neanderthals, but it just happened in Southwest Asia, right? That's what explains why it's in everyone outside of Africa. It and they during interviews would say like it didn't happen in Europe, it just happened in Southwest Asia, and you're like, okay, well that seems an interesting assumption. And that it was like a relatively one-time minor thing, right? And of course, their sample of modern humans, if you look at that paper, they only compared it to five modern humans. Like it was a pretty small sample. But since then, right, the hypothesis that came out of this has continued to be supported. Lots of people, right, basically everyone outside of Africa has Neanderthal DNA, and actually some people in Africa do too. So the story has gotten more and more nuanced since 2010. I remember when this paper came out that my advisor came to my office since I had studied German and asked me how to say "I told you so" in German in response to this because uh, obviously this was a bit fraught in the discipline. And then in the same year, right, we have the publication of the Denisovan DNA. So now we're identifying species almost exclusively from genetic material. Yes, there are fossils of Denisovans at the time, right, but they're really small bones, things that you can't really imagine naming a species based off of, right? Like an intermediate fifth phalanx, it's third molar. But they call them Denisovans, not Homo denisovanensis or Homo denisovan, right? Because it isn't quite clear how they relate to other things that we don't have DNA for, like Homo erectus or other specimens in Asia that are kind of being, thrown into these wastebasket taxons. Um, so they just called them Denisovans, right? Kind of like not quite like we're naming a new species, but like not quite, right? And of course, also at this site, we also had Neanderthals. And so it's been like very exciting to see some of the publications, right, of even the individual that is like a first generation Denisovan Neanderthal hybrid. Really cool stuff coming out of that site. So now if we think about like how the history books or the anthropology textbooks will talk about the 2010s and the 2020s, I mean, I think generally, right, assimilation is canon, right? The idea, okay, definitely we assimilated some archaic humans. Um, but I think the debate now is about degree. So people are interested in finding where this interbreeding happened, get dates, ranges for them. Are there additional interbreeding events, ghost populations, etc.? But we still keep seeing descriptions, and I will show a little bit of this at the end, in the field of these hybrids as less than. So this real emphasis on the idea that like Neanderthal Y chromosome lineages aren't in modern humans, therefore there was something wrong with Neanderthal male hybrids, or that there's been removal of some Neanderthal genes or selection against specific Neanderthal genes. Though if that's the case, then we really interbred with them, right? If they're still up to 4% of modern people. Um, and so I think, we're looking back at like at what happened in 2010 and before that, and we can have a little bit of distance from it. So I think like I'm curious about how we're going to look back at the last, decade and a half in 15 years. Uh, I have some theories, right? Because despite how it still gets described, right, the interbreeding was not minor, right? And if we look at initial Upper Paleolithic modern humans in Europe, so these earliest modern humans, um, which are mostly in Southeast Europe and in Central Europe, and like I said, maybe I didn't emphasize this too much, but I have been excavating in North Macedonia for the last few years. So really thinking about like this kind of crossroads of Europe, people coming in and out of Southeast Asia or the Balkans, um, people at Bakukiro, Wase, and then up into the Czech Republic or Czechia, excuse me. They have recent, right, Neanderthal ancestors. Um, and that shouldn't really surprise us, especially like when we look at the anatomy. But these individuals had Neanderthal grandparents, right, or great grandparents, especially Wase, right, who has a Neanderthal grandparent only 4 to 6 generations back. And before kind of better dating for Bakukiro, Wase was considered the oldest modern human in Europe for a while. New dates from Bakukiro have moved those individuals to be older than Wase, but they also have Neanderthal ancestors 6 to 7 generations back. So again, not that far back. Um, and then the individuals, multiple individuals from Slatikun in Czechia have Neanderthal ancestors further back, more like 70 to 80 generations back. But this still tells us that, right, that the people entering, these modern humans entering Europe were clearly interbreeding with Neanderthals. And every single one of them shows it, right? It's not like some of them have it and some don't. Like clearly there was like a very clear and um, assimilation event that happened with them coming into Europe. And this is kind of like something that's always kind of irked me is we act like the DNA is like the thing that gave us this idea that we had no clue of, and that's not true, right? If we look at the anatomy of Upper Paleolithic modern humans, we'll see plenty of traits that were not present in Africa that magically pop back up in Europe that Neanderthals have, right? Things like we have occipital buns at Cro-Magnon. We have shovel-shaped incisors at Leroy. Wassey's third molars are the largest third molars that have ever been seen in the genus Homo. Where are those coming from, right? So, do we really? I think if the genetics researchers were like more familiar with the fossil anatomy, I think they would have been a little less surprised by their results. Um, it wasn't like this was a total sea change. It's just a change in how we in the field whose ideas we were accepting, right? And this now we know like the hybridization wasn't just this like one-time event, right? That Neanderthals had hybridized with modern humans, like very early modern humans, even earlier than that, and that these late Neanderthals were actually carrying a modern human Y chromosome lineage. It does seem like overall we see a pattern of more of these individuals who were hybridized staying in their mothers or mitochondrial home group, or that males were more likely to jump species. Sure, that might explain some of this. Um, and then instead of describing these things as like these single events, like one night, one Neanderthal had sex with one modern human, right? That we're actually seeing populations that were hybridized, right? And so this is suggested for northern Spain and France here for the Châteauperonian right here by Key and Saresi, who suggest, right, proximal coexistence of different human groups, likely irrespective of their biological classification, right? That if we look especially for dates for the Chattel-Perronian, this is from this image is from the same paper, right? That we've got this period of overlap for Neanderthals and early modern humans, and we often think of like 1400 to 2900 years as being a really small amount of time. But I mean, 1,000 years is more than 60 generations of time. Like it's a very sufficient amount of time for two populations to become completely hybridized and evolve unique cultural signatures, right? And yeah, here Alusa Fox is saying like Neanderthals were not replaced by modern humans, but just absorbed by them. And here's those dates, like thinking of the stuff that's been coming out just in the last few years for like the Chattel-Perronian, it cites like Croix de Rennes, Saint Césaire, that we have Neanderthal anatomy and modern human anatomy, both in Chattel-Perronian layers. Okay, well that's instead of that being like something that's really hard to negotiate or figure out, I think that's actually like kind of nice, right? It suggests that, like, yes, what we're seeing is that people moved into Europe, they hybridized with the people who were living there. There was cultural exchange, there was genetic exchange, and over time, right, the anatomy became predominantly reflective of one group, but not exclusively, right? And maybe, right, with the dates from Groot Mandrin, that we maybe had modern humans entering Europe even a little earlier than what we think of for the Proto-Aurignacian at like, 45,000. And then we have this paper that just came out like last month, I think, right? Looking at school, who's not Upper Paleolithic, right? Who dates to 140,000, but we think of as being those earliest modern humans outside of Africa in Southwest Asia. That the school one child has anatomy that kind of some clusters with modern humans, some with Neanderthals, and they suggest, okay, well maybe it's a first generation hybrid. And that doesn't particularly surprise me for school. I make the joke about the individual school five because when I started at both the University of Missouri St. Louis and Cal State Dominguez Hills, they had casts of school five, and at both institutions it was labeled a Neanderthal, and I had to be like, that's not right. But clearly, so whoever had done that, right, looks at it and saw, right, a big brow ridge, and said like, ah, okay, well that must be put that in the Neanderthal shelf. So it doesn't like it's not particularly surprising, right, that we now suggest that what's happening at school may be evidence of hybridization. Another paper this year as well, looking at Neanderthal and early modern human sites across the region and time period, and arguing right, something we kind of already knew, that we see this cultural homogeneity, right? That they're both making Mousterian. If you just have a site with no fossil remains, you don't know if it's a Neanderthal or early modern human site when we're talking about Southwest Asia, right? And that this interbreeding wasn't just, okay, well, this is where the interbreeding happened, right? We know it happened again more recently than that. So often that description, we think back to 2010 from Max Planck, that, okay, it happened this like, well, they describe it one night in Southwest Asia. No, it wasn't the one night in Southwest Asia, and it wasn't this hybridization that happened here exclusively, right? There was a major gene flow event that occurred more recently than that. So this is something that was happening repeatedly. Um, and I think that if we look kind of take a more global perspective, the Middle Paleolithic to Upper Paleolithic transition is like not that unique, right? We have clear evidence that people were leaving Africa multiple times. If we look at the anatomy, right? So something like Dong at 100,000, which I've worked on because it has oral pathology. In China, I mean, it doesn't have like a huge chin, but it's got chin-ish. So, okay, something's going on. Um, we see that like, Eastern Neanderthals have evidence of interbreeding with a early modern human group before they came to the Altai that the Western Neanderthals don't show evidence of. Obviously, Denisovans were interbreeding with modern humans, and we see that as a signature in people who live in East Asia, and Southeast Asia into Papua New Guinea today. Uh, so there's lots of evidence that this was not something like that was unique, right, just to Southwest Asia or just to Europe, right? The people moving out of Africa were assimilating archaic hominids basically everywhere they went. Um, and I think especially like East Asia, just think about all the papers that have come out just in the last 2 years. We're going to see a, a real change in how we talk about what happened there, right? We're already naming new species. We're moving fossils around and saying, well, actually, they fall into this clade, whereas before we were kind of calling everything Homo erectus or just archaic Homo. Our understanding of what's happening in East Asia is like really shifting. So I say, yeah, come back in a decade and ask me again. That's always what I joke about when I teach this with students. It's like, okay, I'm teaching you what we know now, but it's definitely if you come back just in a few years even, I might have a different story to tell you. And I certainly have to update some slides for this year, actually, in light of what's going on. Thinking about just taxonomic assignments that are happening in East Asia. And I want to juxtapose this idea that right, we keep describing Neanderthals as extinct, but like those Upper Paleolithic modern humans are extinct, right? Wase, Slatikun, Usht-Ishma, they do not appear to have contributed to any recent human populations. Um, yes, some of them did. Like Bako Kiro, we see looks like kind of modern East Asians and Native Americans, but not modern Europeans. Um, so there's clearly like over time we've had population turnover over population turnover happens quite frequently, and I think especially in some place like Europe, which people don't like to describe it as a backwater or a cul-de-sac, but if we look at the geography, it is. Um, there's been a lot of turnover, especially in parts of kind of these small areas of the world like Europe, where those early modern humans entering Europe are not the ancestors of people in Europe today, even barely, right? The late Upper Paleolithic modern humans, which, again, probably additional wave of people, um, they've given a little bit of DNA to contemporary Europeans, but not that much, right? And you could think of these papers that got a lot of attention arguing that modern East Asians actually have more Neanderthal genetic material than modern Europeans, and people are like, that doesn't make sense. I had to deal with my parents arguing about this because my mom thought that she should have more Neanderthal DNA than my father since he's part Native American, and he had more Neanderthal DNA than she did, and she was very offended by this. I had to explain to her why. But I think it's like their kid studies Neanderthal, so they're very invested in it. But she didn't understand why as someone who had fully European ancestry that she would have less Neanderthal genetic material than my father. And part of this is explained, right? Again, by population turnover that just continued to happen in Europe, right? We have Anatolian farmers who came in and brought less Neanderthal ancestry than those European hunter-gatherers. Didn't completely replace them, but we had quite a bit of assimilation that occurred there. Then we have Central Steppe pastoralists who come in, again, bringing genetic material with them that has less Neanderthal DNA. Europe's genetic geography was really interesting, right? And if we look at like Europe today, right? This is just a principal component analysis, just PC1 over PC2. It basically is a map of Europe, right? We have the Portuguese clustering with the Spanish, right? We've got the Sicilians clustering with the Italians. Right? It's not surprising. We just lay it over a map of Europe. It is basically just the biggest difference being kind of a north-south axis, and the second most amount of difference being an east-west axis. But part of this is because like if this paper now is getting older, but I still think I love this quote, right? From Ralph and Coop. Anyone alive 1,000 years ago in Europe who left any descendants will be the ancestor of every European. So yeah, like okay, sorry, Europeans are a little bit inbred, but we're just a species with relatively low genetic diversity, right? And you're not related to everyone who ever lived. You're related to a very small number of people who've ever lived, and there was lots of populations local that died out, right? Again, thinking this idea of the Middle Paleolithic to Upper Paleolithic transition not being unique. Look at what was happening in Southern Africa, for instance, right, where you kept having um, like late Stone Age things be innovated and then disappear and innovated and disappear because population size was low, and once population size got large enough, then we could have this kind of maintenance of some of these things that we call, modern behavior, or in this case, like the late Stone Age archaeological kind of suites. So this brings me back to like, why the heck do we keep saying Neanderthals are extinct, right? We don't describe other hominins this way. We even rarely at this point describe Homo erectus this way. But Neanderthals it maintains. So like just looking at recent papers, right? Um, 2025, 2024, still using the words extinction or disappearance. Maybe that's a little less uh, strong, right, to describe Neanderthals. So I always want to like kind of turn it on its head and say like, okay, yes, you may not be related to most people who ever live, but some people were extremely successful and are related to nearly everyone on the planet, right? Goes back to that picture there I had of the alleged mitochondrial Eve. Again, not one person, right? Mitochondrial Eve is a population of women, but that's how it got onto the cover of Newsweek, etc., because it was this very like appealing idea, right? That everyone goes back to just one woman, right? Um, so I think, I like to frame it more that Neanderthals were an extremely successful species, not an extinct species, right? If everyone alive today has, outside of Africa, has 1 to 4% Neanderthal contribution, and even people in Africa have smaller amounts of Neanderthal contribution, then Neanderthals weren't like a failure to adapt, right? They actually left quite a bit, kind of a major genetic signature in living people. Um, right, they are our ancestors, right? If they're our ancestors, they're not extinct. And those plenty of those early modern humans in Europe did not have descendants. So who's the winner here, right? Um, and you have plenty of genes that are come from Neanderthals. Some of them we might think of as negative, like increasing your risk factor for severe COVID-19. I hope I don't have that one. But also protective alleles against COVID-19, right? This has been kind of a fun thing for people in genetics labs now is to go like hunting down particular Neanderthal alleles for genes that we have, somewhat of an idea of what they do, and kind of make these lists and point out where this is a Neanderthal gene, this is a Neanderthal gene. And it varies. Some of them are things that we might think of as positive. Some of them are things that maybe we don't think of as positive. But that's obviously like uh, a maybe potentially like a disconnect, right, between like the contemporary health moment and genetics. So that might be more of an evolutionary medicine question. But I think the story is going to just keep evolving, right? So we keep having papers come out. Okay, oops, there's actually a ghost population of archaics who bred back into modern humans. We don't even know who they are, right? Like Denisovans, we know who they are somewhat. But even now, like populations in modern West Africa, like this talk will have to be updated at some point, right? As I said before, first time I'm ever giving it, so hopefully I'm maintaining a through line, um, since I do feel a bit uh, wobbly. But I think we can learn a lot about past populations from genetics, but I do think there's a bit of a tendency to think that like DNA is the truth and everything else isn't, or that genetic data is more accurate than other forms of data. Um, and I think that reflects a failure to understand how a lot of these genetic studies are done, right? They have a lot of assumptions in how the studies are designed and how they interpret their results. So it isn't just like an answer gets spit out at the end, right? There is a lot of assumptions and interpretations going in. So sometimes they're not right, right? Um, there's plenty of times where I've read papers where I'm like, well, why would you put that in as the assumption? One that I tend to harp on a lot is a paper that was trying to look for selection for genes for adiposity in women. This is from 2021, um, looking for genes related to adiposity in women and selection for them. And the way the study was set up was the assumption that women would only have had selection for adiposity in um, I have to think about it again. They argue that women had separate labor roles and worked harder under foraging situations. And once they became agriculturalists, that would allow selection for adiposity in women because they didn't have to work as hard as agriculturalists as they did as foragers. And not just everybody, but specifically women, right? So arguing that there was strong labor roles and women worked really had to pull much more of their own weight under foragers than they did under agriculturalists. And if we think about like the paleopathology, that does not bear that out at all. I'm not really sure where they got that idea. But then they set that up and they're like all surprised that they didn't see evidence of it, right? So as I said, kind of like in the subtitle for the talk, right? What does this mean about you? Whether we're talking about uh, like a big audience or a specifically anthropological audience, I think we need to start kind of rethinking the Middle to Upper Paleolithic transition as just kind of one chapter in a long saga of hybridization and culture change. That we fetishize this one particular event, and it's just one of many. And so, why in this one particular event are the losers described as extinct? I don't think they're losers and the others as winners. And yet this is something that was happening over and over again across the planet. This particular event is not unique. It's just one of many, and it didn't result in an extinction, right? The Neanderthal genome is very much present in us today. I think that also challenges people to be to reminded, right? Like I will say these species names, excuse me, because it's easier to describe them by using species names, but I don't actually think that they're a different species. Well, I don't even think Homo erectus is a separate species, but that's another story, right? That they're not a different species. It's a we shouldn't be posing these as taxonomic questions, right? These are just population dynamic questions. So of course we should. I actually think I do need to write a letter to Merriam-Webster because if you notice when that definition they described Neanderthals as hominid with a D and not an N. I'm surprised that in 2025 we still have that floating around in Merriam-Webster. But right, this idea that Neanderthal is a slur certainly should be challenged. So like let's actually look at the language within our own field, right? Not the New York Times, where very much Neanderthal is used as a slur. But um, there's a lot of variation, right? So here in this paper, this is 2019, right? They describe Neanderthals as a hominin phenotype, which I actually quite like. This idea that they're not necessarily a separate species, but like a specific phenotype, or as I said at the beginning, right, like a morphological suite of traits. And then we have, which I think this is an interesting shift for Svante Pabo, if we compare the way that he was talking about Neanderthals in 2010 now to 2024, right? We predict that very few, if any, differences will distinguish all modern humans from all Neanderthals and Denisovans, right? Suggesting there's been quite a bit of interbreeding and gene flow between these three populations, and there's not going to be some sort of one thing that differentiates all modern humans from all Neanderthals and all Denisovans, right? But then, right, we look at an interview here with Ludovic Slimak, where he just says he's frustrated with people trying to kind of romanticize Neanderthals. And he thinks by just making them, an ersatz sapien, that we're taking away the fact that they have this other kind of humanity and that kind of humanity is extinct, totally extinct. Well, okay, but I think he's an archaeologist. I think he's thinking a lot about uh, the culture that we associate with Neanderthals, and certainly that culture is extinct. But then that would apply to any fossil human, right? And then we have a paper that came out just 2 years ago that was like very exciting, right? That found evidence of archaic Homo introgressions into modern Africans. And one of the authors describing it as so a Neanderthal allele might work great in Neanderthals, but you plop it in a modern human and it causes problems. Both modern humans and Neanderthals slowly rid themselves of the alleles of other groups. Okay. Um, the hybrids didn't work so well, which means they were very far along the path to becoming distinct species. We have no evidence of that. So the hybrids didn't work so well. If the hybrids didn't work so well, we wouldn't have evidence of their genetic material in people today, unless the hybridization was just so extensive, right? Which we don't quite see evidence of. Um, this is gets back to like the assumptions that people are bringing into it, right? And if we want to argue that Neanderthals and modern humans were so well on the path to becoming distinct species, like this would be the fastest speciation event that's ever happened on the planet, right? If we think about one of these like really rapid speciation events would be bison and cows, which speciated in about 1 million years, so they do not produce fertile offspring. And they have a generational length of what, like 3, 4 years? So we have a generational length of what, at minimum 15? So no. Like if we were well on the path to becoming a distinct species, we would be it would be like the most unusual thing that's happened in speciation biology. I I when I read this kind of stuff, it like frustrates me
Yeah.
a bit. So
Yeah.
like we'll bring it back, right? So, admixture and migration are the rule, not the exception across hominids, right? And I think when we look back now on this period in our field, um, we're gonna wonder why there's such this emphasis on Neanderthal extinction and not Neanderthal like survival and resilience. Um, so in one way, this like talk might be like a bit of a just kind of a thought experiment, but I do think it's like interesting to reflect on like kind of what people are saying, language that they're using in the field, juxtaposing it with the actual data that we have, and kind of thinking about where we might go as like what's kind of like the center position in the field because it certainly has changed, right? Um, I turned 40 a couple weeks ago, and so comparing to like way we were talking about it in when I was an undergrad to grad student to now has shifted quite a bit. So I'm hopeful that it's going to go in a direction that I think is a better description of what the evidence actually shows. So, yeah, thank you so much for sitting with me through this. It was like perfect timing, 44 minutes. And so I'd love to like, you know, get some feedback from you guys. What are your positions on this? What do you think? This is again, as I said, this is somewhat of a thought experiment, but I think that, you know, I want us to be like more openly talking about the ways that we talk about Neanderthals.
Yeah, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I really, really enjoyed it. If you want to unshare your screen, we can take some questions.
Sure.
We've got a hand up from Terry, if you'd like to go first.
Good morning, Dr. Lacy. Um, so I just had a quick question about these school five, and I apologize if I missed the explanation. I'm multitasking this morning. Um, what were the features that lead you to believe that it may be hybrid?
So
School five.
yeah, so School 5 has like a very strong brow ridge for a modern human, which is
Hmm.
why I think that it has been like mislabeled in so many labs. It doesn't have an occipital bud, but it's just generally very robust. Um, it gets described as within the range of variation of modern humans, but it's certainly on the tail end of the distribution for robusticity.
Okay, thank you. Feel better.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Did we take a question from Rebecca?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I just want to say thanks for the talk. It was really interesting, especially since you are obviously ill, so very much appreciated. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to give you a little bit of feedback actually on it, and it was a couple of sort of points that were just striking me as you were going through. One is that I think the issue with the attribution of species to the IUP, especially the Chateaubriandian, um, it's still super problematic because we only have a couple of sites where we have skeletal material, and they are all like taphonomically quite unclear. So I think at the moment, like the sites we do have where we have Chateaubriand and it's nicely like bracketed with no mixing and it's all good. There's no evidence of Neanderthal association with those in terms of the fossil material. So that's a problem that we've got for all of those contexts. And that's going to be ongoing and people will keep working on that. So that's really good. But like a broader point, which I think might be sort of useful in terms of the way that the points that you're making about how we talk about who is extinct and who isn't. And like you say, I think a lot of people are accepting the idea that plenty of Upper Paleolithic sapiens subpopulations are not genetically sort of relevant anymore and they are therefore extinct. But I think there's an issue going on as well in terms of the way that we tend to treat the Neanderthals as a monolithic population, because as far as I'm aware, if you look at the genetic material that is in extant populations from Neanderthals, number one, it's only identifiable from one breeding event, although we know others happened because we know it's in those other more ancient fossil samples. And we've never found any Neanderthal genomes from that population that introgressed into living people. So in that sense, most of the Neanderthals are extinct, but some of them aren't, just like it is with those Pleistocene Homo sapiens. So I think that kind of you're able to say that about both of them, that yes, some of the Neanderthals are definitely not extinct, but a lot of them are. So
I think
that's
that's a
kind
good
of the
framing, right? Because then you have a nice analogy between what's happening for modern humans and Neanderthals. It's a similar pattern.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. We've got time for a couple more questions. You can either feel free to write them in the chat or you can raise your hand as Rebecca and Terry have. We have got a couple of people in the chat saying a big thank you, which I definitely, yeah, thank you from me as well. We've got a hand up from John. Go ahead.
Yes, hi. Right. Um, yeah, it's been a lovely talk, actually. It's so up to date and thought-provoking. I really enjoyed it. I just had a thought that, in a way, don't we seem to have too many apparent hybrids? Yeah? Do you think so?
I feel like how do we get so lucky to keep finding these first generation hybrids?
Yeah, well, that was it. Considering how big the populations are and how few samples we have, it just seems to me we shouldn't really be finding so many. But do you agree with that?
Yeah, I can't, well, like, yes, I'm surprised by it. I think the genetics at Denisova is like, wow, how lucky did we get here? I think that the description of school one as a first generation hybrid, I think is a bit of a stretch. Um, it looks hybridized. All right. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a first generation hybrid, right? Because both parents could just be hybridized themselves, right? Um, but that gets more media attention probably.
Well, thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
It's me again. I was really interested to ask you about the whole Lagarvelio thing because although there were some nuances in how that was discussed by people involved in that research, I still find that when that is presented to the public, it's a Neanderthal sapiens hybrid. They use those words and it's still there all the time. And I think that's a really interesting context because for that child to show features that are, if this is correct, if the features on that child, which as I understand, not everybody sort of accepts that really even is a mix of Neanderthal features, but let's say it was, you would need to have had a Neanderthal population surviving in presumably Iberia, for something like 10,000 years in a pure enough form to then impact within what, a few centuries, like 10 generations or less, to affect that child. So I'm not I mean that sounds a bit crazy to me, but maybe that's possible. But that kind of thing as a scenario, perhaps that's actually quite interesting for us when we think about the very recent publication on the so-called Thorin Neanderthal from Magdalenian, that whether or not Thorin's like population actually were based in the Rhone Valley for like forever, and that's where they became isolated, they still were isolated somewhere. So maybe that's actually making this whole Lagavulio scenario not quite so weird anymore. I don't know. I just think it's a really interesting sort of coming back to the arguments over that particular child.
Yeah, I think we go back to when we first had this, right, in the mid 2000s. We were still accepting some of those now known to be incorrect carbon-14 dates for other parts of Spain. So it was like it looked like, oh, it's only 5,000 years versus 10 plus thousand years.
Mm.
Um, and I think Eric generally was pretty good at describing it as just like a population that had hybridization. I do think occasionally some of the Portuguese colleagues, it's like, again, it gets you more media attention, frequently frame it as like someone who was more recently hybridized. And so that's kind of like a something I just touch with like a 10-foot pole. Because I don't, it has Neanderthal-like body proportions. It doesn't really have any sort of like specific, unique Neanderthal morphological traits. But I do think it is an interesting exercise as an example of like the way we were talking about it, because at the time that was the Neanderthals didn't interbreed with modern humans at all time, and so that even suggesting they were hybridized was like taboo. But it's also maybe empowered some people now to like center this individual as an example where it doesn't have any. It's just it's like the length of its tibia, basically.
Yeah, yeah. There's an art project that was on this year in the States. And there's an artist that's been working like as an artist in residence with the team there, and his take home from it was very much this is a hybrid. So I think that's kind of one point. It's like how we talk about this issue to non-specialists who can sort of use or drop nuance depending on what we want to focus on. But the vocabulary we use for the public is actually quite challenging, I think. But yeah, like in general, this whole question about how many hybrids there are, what does it mean for ORs to have had a Neanderthal ancestor, say 200 years before that individual was alive? Would they have known that? What would that have meant to them? And I think that's actually a real challenge for us um, to start thinking a little bit about, you know, what could that have looked like? Could you have had little populations of Neanderthals literally hanging around for a very long time? Is that unfeasible? Why would it be unfeasible? So I think all these questions that are interesting you are things that we really have to tackle, but it's very difficult with, you know, the archaeological information in some ways is much less informative than the genetics, you know, and I think the marrying of those two things is our big ongoing challenge, really.
Oh, that's like partially why I've been working in the Balkans is okay, well, if this is where this is like this crossroads is and a likely place of contact, what do we see archaeologically? Because there hasn't been very much work done, and like in Macedonia, where I've been working, according to the National Museum there, I was the only American archaeologist working on any time period. Of course, there's people from other parts of Europe, predominantly Germany, but it just shows that it's like kind of like not on the map, right? And like, or like there's one team working pretty solidly near the border in Serbia, but it's like these certain areas because of modern geopolitics don't necessarily get explored, though we haven't been particularly successful, which is a bit sad. But I did not know about this artist in residence, and I'm gonna have to
Yeah.
look this up.
Thanks very much.
Thanks. It's really nice to listen into your discussion. We probably have time for one more question if anybody has a burning thing to ask Sarah? Just check the chats.
Well, I'm going to make some notes based on some of these questions because this was very helpful. Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure. And I think if nobody else has any questions, I think it would say a big thank you from all of us. Thank you for joining us. It's been really thought-provoking. And thank you to everybody that's joined. It's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was great.
Bye.